Hello, this is the AI Lab. Today it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Carys J. Craig. Carys is the Academic Director of the Osgood Professional Development LLM program in Intellectual Property Law and recently served as Osgood's Associate Dean. A recipient of multiple teaching awards, Carys researches and publishes widely on intellectual property law and policy, with an emphasis on authorship, users' rights, and the public domain. The reason? An article entitled The AI Copyright Trap. Let's hear what Carys has to say. Carys, what is the copyright trap in the context of AI, and why do you believe that relying on copyright law to regulate AI-generated content could do more harm than good?
So we're hearing a lot about AI and generative AI these days in policy debates, and the copyright trap, as I understand it, is the growing tendency for policymakers and commentators and the public to think of copyright as a solution to the problems and the risks and the threats that they perceive in connection with generative AI. So we hear people talk about ethical AI. I find that we're often framing the question of what is ethical and responsible AI as though that's a matter of respect for copyright law, respect for artists and authors, and ensuring that the data sets that AI has been trained on have been secured with permission from copyright owners. So while we're having, a really important conversation about the trajectory of this technology and the way that it's going to affect our culture and the way that we interact with one another and our society, we keep running into what I'm calling a copyright trap. That is thinking about copyright as something that is going to help us to regulate AI appropriately. It's going to help us to ensure that our culture and our creators are protected in the face of this potential sort of substitution of human cultural content for AI-generated content. And I'm suggesting that then the turn to copyright law is turn to really a false friend. The idea that copyright is going to be our friend, is going to help us in this situation, I am warning that it's likely to do more harm than good. And in that sense, I think that we are imagining increasingly in these policy debates that copyright and protection of copyright owners will be a kind of counterweight to corporate power, to the sort of extractive logics of big tech and AI development. I think that that is misguided, and in fact, we're playing into the interests of both the entertainment industries and big tech when we turn to copyright for our solutions. So what I'm arguing is that as we think about how we should be rewriting our laws to respond to this new and sort of paradigm shifting technology, we really are going to be shaping the way that this technology develops for the foreseeable future. And so when we run into the copyright trap, this sort of conviction that copyright is going to be the right regulatory tool, we are sort of defining how this technology is going to evolve in a way that I think will backfire and will actually undermine the political objectives of those who are pointing to the inequities and the unfairness behind the technology and the way that it's being developed. So calling it a trap suggests, I guess, in a sense, that it's a trap that is being laid for us. And I think to a degree it is, because it actually does align with the interests of a small group of powerful corporations. AI industry, big tech industry, and the creative industry stakeholders are all, I think, perfectly happy to approach these larger policy questions through the sort of logic of copyright, sort of proprietary logic of ownership, control, exchange in the free market, licensing structures that we're already seeing taking hold. So the market incumbents are not, in fact, resisting the turn to copyright here. It works quite well for them. They can afford to buy large data sets to train their models on. It excludes potential competitors who can't get access to that data. And also at the same time, it ensures that there's a little bit of a windfall profit for the entertainment industries who have stood in the sort of market incumbent position until now. And so everybody wins, except I think for the public and except for perhaps the creators and the authors and the artists that we are imagining we're protecting. So it's a trap because it's attractive. People think, well, this is a good solution. There's going to be an exchange of value. It's going to help to support human authors and creators and shore up our sort of culture in the face of the AI threat. I'm just suggesting that's not how it's going to play out. And in fact, we're going to allow the big industry actors to sort of parcel out intellectual properties and to control and own data and to transact around it just using the old sort of market logic, private ordering. And meanwhile, the technology will continue to develop, I think, unabated. And the alienation, the exploitation, the substitution of human creativity for machine-generated outputs is likely to continue. And more specifically, it's worth pointing out that not only is it about how we think about the development of AI, it's also just about the quality of the technology that we'll be receiving, right? So we have a sense, and we're, I'm not a technologist, but we're told all the time, garbage in, garbage out. You need good data sets. More data, the better, to create the most sort of sophisticated models. I also am interested in making sure that what we get out is as sort of inclusive as possible, that it's not just always tending to, the sort of the core cultural producers. Let's imagine the sort of Hollywood content, American internet users, that actually we have a technology that reflects heterogeneity, that reflects diverse cultures, that reflects different languages. And so what we're going to see, I think, if we run into the copyright trap is that certainly smaller developers, but really everyone, will be training the technology on incomplete data sets, the data sets that reflect the sort of big packaged data products that have been exchanged for value between the main market actors. So that's going to lessen the quality, really, of what's going in generally by making it more exclusive and less inclusive. And then the smaller actors that can't access those large data sets, which are now priced for the market and for the larger actors, are going to be using incomplete data sets, poor quality data, and perhaps only public domain data. And that has implications as well, like exacerbating potential bias and just limiting the quality of the technology that we can access. Finally, and I think this is something that we often forget when we're talking about this debate, because we tend to be thinking mostly about generative AI these days, but really we're talking about text and data mining processes and sort of informational analysis more broadly. And so it's worth thinking too that the limits on research, on training, on testing, and the likely damage that's done to efforts towards transparency, that these are going to have implications not just for sort of commercial generative AI products, but for the quality and the capacity of researchers and smaller actors to engage in that kind of AI training, but also text and data mining and informational analysis that presumably we want them to be free to do.
So, looking at those dangers and looking at the copyright trap, I think your article also explains how we got there to a certain extent. And you identify three premises, three thought processes that lead into that copyright trap. First, you talk about the if value then property right fallacy. Secondly, you talk about the inherent wrongness of unauthorized copying that is perceived by some. And finally, the starving artist trope. So, could you briefly describe each of these and their relevance to the current AI debates?
Yeah, that's right. So what I do in the paper is identify those three routes by which I think critical commentators are running into the copyright trap. So I'm speaking really to the people who are engaged not just in the copyright debates, but who are engaged more broadly in a sort of activism around the arrival of AI on a number of fronts. And so often this is not really a conversation that's being had by copyright experts, but rather by whether it's regulators and policymakers or other commentators who are concerned about the way that the technology is developing and therefore turning again to copyright as a potential solution. And so the routes that I identify as sort of leading people into the copyright trap are not new. Really, I'm pulling on a lot of the older scholarship and literature that emerged around copyright with the arrival of the internet, with the arrival of peer-to-peer file sharing technologies, and even going back before that, just thinking about the nature of copyright and what it protects and why. So the first route that I identify is what's sometimes called the if value then right fallacy. So that's the assumption that if something has value, then there should be or must be some right over it. Typically, that's a sort of proprietary entitlement. Right? So I talk in the paper about the entitlement narratives that have developed around copyright, and this is an important one. So this often happens when we're having debates about the copyrightability of AI outputs, for example. When I say, and I've argued elsewhere, I don't think that AI outputs should be protected as copyrightable works. And then sometimes the response back is, well, are you saying they have no value? Like, we understand the value of these outputs, they're important cultural artifacts. And my response is to say, just because I think something shouldn't be protected by copyright, I don't think it's valueless. I just don't think that we need to attach rights to everything that has value. So that's one example of it. But I think what is also happening for our purposes on the other side is that we tend to assume, on the same logic, that anyone who's reaping value from a work without getting permission to do so has taken something to which they're not entitled. Right? They're benefiting from something to which they have no right. And so the value then right fallacy sort of supports this proprietary approach to thinking about the data that's being used. Is the data valuable? Of course. But talking about data mining, talking about data as the new oil, it sort of reveals that what we're really arguing about is just the economic value of something. And because something has value, whether economic or social, doesn't mean we should turn it into property that can be owned and controlled through these sort of exclusive rights that we find in copyright law. So that's the first route. The second route that I identify is a sort of obsession with copying and the idea that copying is inherently just a wrongful activity. In fact, of course, I mean, we're talking about copyright, so copying is certainly central to that. But the reality is that that there's nothing inherently wrongful about copying. And in fact, this is how we learn, this is how we create, that copying is kind of a fundamental part of the way that the culture sort of accrues and develops. And copyright law knows this, right? There are many ways in which we build room to copy into the copyright system. The freedom to copy ideas, the freedom to copy information, and yes, data. The freedom to engage in fair copying, whether it's through fair dealing or fair use or other limits and exceptions, the freedom to copy from the public domain. And so if we assume that copying is wrong to begin with, then we regard it sort of as almost an immoral act to engage in the copying that is required to compile data sets and to train AI. So that's one aspect of it. There's no inherent moral wrong to copying, and we should remember this. The other is that copyright is obsessed with, because of its sort of technological origins, it's obsessed with individual copies. Like we regard, it used to be just a physical copy of something, whether it's copying a manuscript, making a photocopy. Then we adapted that to saying, okay, digital copies still count as copies, even if they're really intangible, they're still relevant. But this focus on the individuated copy has come under increasing stress as technology has evolved. And I think at this particular moment, one of the clearest routes into the copyright trap is saying, well, you have to make copies of text in order to train AI. So of course, copyright is implicated, and of course, we have to prevent that from happening without permission. Right? And what I'm arguing really is, first of all, that we have to step back from the moral assumption copying is wrong, but also that those behind the scenes sort of transient copies or even permanent or even semi-permanent copies that are made in order to compile the data sets, in order to train the AI, that those are not copies that should be relevant for the copyright analysis. They're kind of behind the scenes. They're only read by machines as a source of information. So they're not used as expressive works, which is what copyright protects. They're not being used by the machine for their meaning. They're being used to turn that meaning into maths, to create sort of probabilities and statistics that allow them to go on and do what they do. But as a probability machine, it's not using the expression. The AI is not engaged then in the same way that an audience is engaged or a reader is engaged when they make a copy that's relevant for copyright purposes. Finally, even more than that, I think we have to recognize that this is less about individual discrete copies that are being made, in the background on a scale that we've never seen before, and more about understanding the data itself as kind of a sea of data that, yes, we might have to govern and we might have to regulate, we might have to think about the best way to ensure the accessibility and the quality of the sea of data. But our obsession with the individuated sort of discrete copies of works behind the scenes is now an anachronism that we really need to let go. There is a third, so apologies for the long answer, but the third route that I identify into the copyright trap, and I think in the sort of public discourse and maybe even the policy discourse, this is the one that is rising to the fore, is the faith in copyright as an answer to the sort of economic struggles and woes of the starving artist. And this shouldn't surprise us at all. This is an old trope that has been trotted out with every technological shift, and in fact was sort of foundational in the development of the copyright system itself. Back in the 1700s, the argument was made that the artists were starving, and that was why the artist sort of emerged as the sort of central figure of copyright law. The artist does, or author, even the romantic author there, does a lot of work in justifying the whole copyright system. But as anyone who is an artist or an author knows, the copyright doesn't do an awful lot to actually ensure the remuneration of artists or creators, or to ensure that a professional class of creators has a viable sort of wage to live on, a livable wage. Many people have spoken. Rebecca Giblin's done a lot of work on this. I know she's spoken to you previously about the gap between copyright as a reward for authors, which is how we justify it, and then the reality of copyright as a source of sort of corporate profit. This is, of course, a larger problem. But I just want to point to the fact that in these debates over generative AI, there is a genuine and I think completely reasonable fear about the potential sort of substitutionary effect of this kind of synthetic creativity, if you will, and what that's going to mean for our cultural landscape, what it's going to mean for creators and artists and authors. But once again, using the figure of the artist as a reason to expand copyright control and assuming that that's going to magically turn into lining the pockets of artists and creators seems to me to be a fallacy and a route into the copyright trap. Many of the solutions I see being proposed around how to deal with generative AI and copyright, even things that involve sort of large collective licensing models, these structures seem to me that it would just be impossible for them to create the kind of economic benefits that people are imagining flowing to authors, creators, and individual people. Certainly, as I've said, there might be a bit of a corporate windfall. The collective management organizations might also do quite well, but the chances that this is going to be the thing that supports human creativity in the face of generative AI just seems to me at best naive, but certainly something that is being used and deployed to advance a particular goal.
So looking at those risks and looking at the fallacies that you've exposed, what alternative approaches do you suggest policymakers and maybe AI critics should consider to protect creators, which at the end of the day, we're all claiming that's the goal, and to address the challenges posed by generative AI?
So first of all, I think when I say protect creators, I think ultimately my goal is protecting creativity and human creativity. And so one of the things I resist somewhat is the distinction between creators and everybody else, to the extent that we're doing that. I think we have to be very careful to recognize that this is actually about our cultural environment in which we all exist. We are all engaged in expressive activity. We are all concerned with the accessibility of information and the sort of drive to meaning, sharing of knowledge. That affects all of us. And so I actually think that it might be important to emphasize as a starting point that it's sort of the health of our cultural environment that is the biggest concern, and not simply or only protecting creators as a separate class of sort of professional actors. And so then when it comes to like, well, so then how do we do that? One of the arguments I made and I mentioned earlier already is I think not protecting AI generated outputs with copyright could be an important start. We don't want to sort of encourage and reward, nor do we have to, the use of generative AI to create content. In fact, what we have now, I think, is a change in the costs of engaging in expressive activity. People talk about the sort of the democratization of creativity, or just, and Dan Burke talks about cheap creativity, but the cost of engaging in creation using AI is obviously less than what it would be without this tool. So I think what we could do is shift our copyright policy focus to protecting and encouraging human authorship by refusing to protect AI generated outputs. I also think there's a role for copyright in thinking about the outputs, those outputs as potentially infringing. To be clear, if the outputs of generative AI are substantially similar to works on which the AI was trained, then those are infringing outputs, and copyright law will apply to them, such that to distribute those infringing copies would produce liability under the system as it currently exists. We don't need any changes to the law, I don't believe, in order to capture the kinds of outputs that might be substituting in the market for human creativity. And we should remember this. We're really just talking about debates over how the AI is trained. When it comes to, I'm saying copyright is not the answer. And in part, sometimes I think, I'm a copyright specialist. I also specialize in trademark law, so I can see that there's some misrepresentation problems that we could maybe address, some certification solutions for what's human created versus AI created that might be helpful. But in part, what I'm saying is it's just not copyright. So just the same way, if you go to a heart specialist and they tell you your heart is fine, you might have to just go see another doctor who is an expert. So there are privacy experts who might be much better placed to say, like, how should we curate or ensure that we regulate the data on which the machines are trained? And I would be supportive of those kinds of interventions at the input stage, if they're well rationalized and if they, produce the right and appropriate outcomes. So really, I would urge that we don't misdiagnose the problem. The problem is not that copies are being made in data sets on which AI is trained, right? The problem might be that this is going to have an impact on our culture and it's going to harm particular industries. It could create privacy concerns. It's going to exacerbate problems, social problems, all of which we can address through the systems that we already have, rather than using copyright to clamp down at the training stage. So I do, towards the end of the paper, I really think is in the conclusion, just say, well, if not copyright, then what? And it's kind of opening up the conversation and hopefully, I think, steering the conversation away from copyright into what some of those solutions might be. I suggest, and I'm only being a little facetious, that if the plight is really the plight of struggling artists, and that's the thing that we're trying to solve, or starving artists, that, well, first of all, nobody should be starving, whether they're artists or not artists. And so we have a larger social problem, that copyright has never been the thing that has stopped artists from struggling economically. We've had copyright for hundreds of years, and this is an ongoing problem. And so I suggest, again, a little facetiously, perhaps, that universal basic income could be the solution to that. And our tax structures more broadly. We're going to have to think about better ways to fund culture and the arts and to support our creative classes, if that's the goal. Copyright seems like a tempting way to do it, but that's not what it does. And so maybe rather than some of the big collective licensing solutions that are being imagined in this context, we'd be better off thinking about tax solutions where we properly tax big tech, and then we use that tax in a way that actually supports the things that we as a society care about, including funding culture and the arts. So it's all a little bit speculative at that point, because the main argument is it's not copyright. Copyright's not going to help you. But I invite many others into the fray to think about how best to address this problem if we sidestep effectively the copyright trap.
Well, thank you so much, Carys, for this explanation. I think it's really useful. It's very useful seeing the current debates we're having also in Europe on the code of conduct of AI and how to follow up on TDM, text and data mining. And as you know, there's different consultations that happen around this code of conduct. I encourage you to maybe share your article with those drafting. And thank you again for your time.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I enjoyed the conversation.